Upon leaving, the narration screeches to a halt. If you think that is to describe something completely mundane that is irrelevant to the plot, you would be correct. But I'll bet that you weren't guessing that it was to stop to describe a golden Fred and Mercury statue. Hello and welcome to Precontation Point's video Snark. If you came here because you thought that this was an audiobook, please stick around and maybe learn some reading and listening comprehension skills. I read books, discuss what went wrong, and how they can possibly be fixed. I'm continuing my read-through of The Cuckoo's Calling by Robert Galbraith. Not the first video, go check out the others, links are posted below. This book contains harsh scenes that some people might find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 4. We jump back over to Robin's point of view as she listens to the argument going on inside of Strike's office. The narration wastes no time in hammering in how terrible that Strike has treated Robin in the past 30-so minutes, and acts as though him grabbing her to prevent her from falling over the stairs was 100% his fault. So he should have simply let her fall then? Because that's the only thing that I'm getting here. Robin turns her attention to the girlfriend, and the narration once again stops so that it can describe her appearance, except that it's not exactly nice about it and makes her out to be this ugly lady, which, wow, simply because you're writing with a man's name on the front cover doesn't give you an excuse to write like you're applying for the men failing to write women posts. Anyway, the girlfriend, Allison, is also of the opinion that Lula really had killed herself and wishes that John would give up this quest for the truth. You know that it's bad when your own partner isn't on your side. We then jump back to Strike, who has since convinced John to sit back down and not take his business elsewhere. He takes the money finally and instructs John to tell him what happened on the day Lula died. John says that he saw Lula the day before she died, early in the morning when they'd had a row. It was about Lula's boyfriend, Evan, who was a known addict and chronic self-publicist. I'm not quite sure what that is, but John seemed to think that it was bad business in regards to Lula. His family thought that Evan was obviously no good for her, and they'd been thrilled when they'd broken up, but the fight was because they'd gotten back together again, because of course they had. And as you can imagine, Lula didn't exactly want to hear that nobody else liked her boyfriend. He continues on and says that Lula left, but that he went over to her flat to drop off the contract that she'd asked him to look over. He'd encouraged her to pop in and visit their mother, who'd recently had surgery. Later, John said that he again saw Lula visiting with their mother. At this point, John becomes too upset to continue on, so Strike goes out to the front to get more coffee from Robin. Allison says that John had another appointment, but I think that Strike is simply happy to have another case. When he goes back in, John kind of speeds up a little bit. He says some stuff about what Lula had been doing during her last couple of hours, but this is more info that the police would have looked into and not simply because John himself was there. Lula went shopping with a fellow female model, hung out for a bit at Lula's flat, and then met up with some others for dinner and then went dancing. At the club, Lula and Evan had a huge publicly seen argument where Lula eventually stormed off. Here, Strike pauses again to ask that Evan had been cleared of charges since he had an airtight alibi. John agrees and says that it was Evan's drug dealer who gave him an alibi, which, okay. Lula was photographed going back into her building less than an hour before her death. John says that the paparazzi were always running around hoping to get shots of her, especially if Evan was around or if they knew that she'd been drinking. But the night of her death, they'd also been running around the building for some rapper DB Mac, who was the main reason why they were there. After she got in, they started to leave because they got word that DB Mac wasn't supposed to come back for hours. It's also worth noting that it was really cold the night she died, so not only were there no press outside, but there was literally nobody around because of the temperature. At this point, Strike tells John that Allison had told him of a prior appointment. John is startled at how long he'd been in Strike's office talking about his sister. They briefly discuss payment before leaving. Outside, Allison seems kind of fed up that Strike would have accepted John as a client, but doesn't say anything about it before they leave. Chapter 5. After John and Allison leave, Strike asks Robin for her name since he kept calling her Sandra. He also asks where she got the cups, and she says the guy in the graphic design business downstairs, and that she'd promised to return them before lunch. Strike is honestly impressed with their professionalism and education since the note she'd given him had proper punctuation and everything. She then urgently tells him that he's received a death threat. She obviously wants to take it to the police and even put the envelope and letter into a plastic baggie. Strike kind of laughs it off and instructs her to put it in a filing cabinet in the corner, that in there she'd find 6 months worth of death threats from the same guy. He then says that he's going out for a bit and that she's welcome to leave for lunch if she wants. Upon leaving, the narration screeches to a halt. If you think that is to describe something completely mundane that is irrelevant to the plot, you would be correct. But I'll bet that you weren't guessing that it was to stop to describe a golden Fred and Mercury statue. However, since there's like 475 pages of this book left, obviously Strike is not going to hit the streets in search of answers about Lula's death. Instead, he goes to a pub, where he proceeds to drink a lot of beer and get turned on by an old Victorian painting. I wish I was kidding about the last part. And then, because he's a little drunk, he starts to think about Charlotte. I'm still not quite sure who Charlotte is to him, though. The only thing that this does is to further establish that no matter their relationship, it's toxic as anything. He continues to wanks over Charlotte for around 2 pages. None of it is relevant. When he switches over to his other woes, we learn that he has a prosthetic leg. I don't know if this is going to be relevant or not, but I'm fully expecting some kind of wartime flashbacks, maybe some PTSD. After finishing 3 beers, Strike then calls an old police friend of his and asks who was in charge of Lila's case. The narration spends way too long on simply what should have been a throwaway line. This book is over 500 pages, and this is why. Strike then calls a mystery friend and asks for leverage on a copper. I'm guessing that copper isn't the metal. The conversation is glossed over in a single paragraph, which the reader gains no actual information other than the conversation took a long time, which makes me wonder why the author bothered to even write the paragraph in the first place. That done, Strike calls the lead detective for Lula's case, Wardle. Cormoran Strike, said Strike, is my name. Why would you write this? It has suddenly occurred to me that the reason why there's so much unnecessary info and weird lines like this is simply because the publisher knew that it was actually J.K. Rowling and decided to send the book to print as is. Please do not correct me if I am wrong. I refuse to believe that a published novel could possibly be this poorly edited. Also, I hate how this isn't even the worst grammatical mistake in a novel that was published to a large publisher that I've seen. Anyway, the first police officer had called ahead, so Wardle figured that Strike would be calling. He then laughs when Strike flat out asks for Lula's file, says that he doesn't owe Strike anything. Strike then says that he has info that Wardle might be interested in. The two of them agree to meet up in a week in a pub near Scotland Yard. After hanging out, Strike falls again into his personal wanks. He remembers the good old days when he could command when and where interviews would be. He gets a call from the office, but figures that it must be Robin to complain about his bill collectors. He ignores it, but leaves the pub to waste time until he's certain that Robin will have gone home for the day. Chapter 6. We jump back to Robin, who waited 10 minutes after Strike left before calling up her friends and family to tell them about her engagement. She then putters around doing typical secretary stuff. She tidies up, answers the phone, and generally tries to make herself useful. Robin does take a look at some of the other death threats Strike had mentioned and decides to leave one of them on his desk. I'm not sure that I understand why, but okay. As she's leaving his office after that, she sees his bag full of personal items such as soap, and she feels as if she's accidentally seen something more private than the evidence that the man had been crashing in his office. Overall, this chapter was nothing more than 2.5 pages of filler. We didn't need to read about how the downstairs neighbor was eyeing Robin up. We don't really care about the paperwork she left on his desk. We don't give a hoot about the phone calls and messages she took. Chapter 7. Back to Strike now. He seeks his way into a university dorm room so that he can get a shower. Then he spends the cash he'd been given for taking on the Lulu case to get some necessary supplies before he wastes even more time in a bar. After dark, he carries a camping bed upstairs to his office where he proceeds to eat one of those cup of noodle things. Although he curses Charlotte the entire time, he's also strangely comforted by the familiarity of it. It seems as though he spent some time in his childhood being homeless, and the almost obligatory time spent in the military exactly as I had predicted earlier. It's worth noting that all of this takes up the first 2 pages of this chapter. Like, we get it. He's a freaking loser whose mother made poor life choices and now he's making poor life choices. Can we please get back to the murder mystery? Anyway, after he finishes setting up so that he can sleep there, he starts to organize the stuff John had given him. Then we pause the plot to talk about his petty cash tin, where Robin said that Strike owed him 42 pounds for the chocolate biscuits. Don't get me wrong. I'm grateful that 7 chapters in, and the worst thing that's going on is that the author is sprinkling some plot on this padding. But still, I'm quite annoyed that every other paragraph we have to stop literally everything to spend at least half a page describing the most asinine things imaginable. We then spend about a page going over the footage John had given him, and no, stop it. Longtime followers of mine will know that my favorite shows are Law and Order, quickly followed by FBI, both by Dick Wolf. When you're watching a crime drama, it's common for them to watch some sort of security footage in order to find possible witnesses or the suspect. But the problem is that when you're watching literally any crime drama, this scene usually lasts for about 30 seconds and somebody usually explains what's happening to the viewer. The problem with reading about watching security footage is that footage taken from the same CCTV camera shortly after showed the runner sprinting back past the camera at 2:12 and out of sight. This goes on for freaking half a page and is sprinkled with notes that John had made. Literally none of it means anything to the reader at this point. The author might as well have written "Strike watch the footage" and moved the frick on. Having seen the footage, Shrek then reads the rest of Jon Snow's. He says that he interviewed the doorman who was in the bathroom for about a quarter of an hour. Literally anybody could have gotten into the building at that time. Shrek then gets into bed where he lies there and thinks about his huge fight with Charlotte, whom we're finally told is his fiancée. But it seems as though she's been lying to him a lot and he's not certain that they can ever recover from the fight that they had earlier. The entire woe is me nonsense lasts for a full page before the chapter mercifully ends, without any more hint of plot anywhere to be found. He's more focused on Charlotte than Lula, which I don't care about Charlotte. Please solve Lula's murder! Thanks for listening to my book Snark on YouTube. New videos are up every Monday, but stick around because I sometimes drop random videos on other days too. Just as a reminder, even if you can't financially support me, there are other ways to help me out. The first is watching this video as well as all my other videos. It's also important to like and subscribe. Finally, you can share this video with all of your friends so that they can help as well. If you're already caught up with all of my videos, you can go to Tumblr for my main book, Snark's always free and updated every morning. Newly added to Patreon is to become a member without paying. You'll get access to the same things on Tumblr, but on Patreon. Also new is a 1-week free Patreon trial, so be sure to check that out. Special thanks to Dawn, Phoebe, and Nikki for supporting me on Patreon already. If you want to hear your name in my video next week, either support me on Patreon or make a one-time donation. Do you like my snark so much that you want me to snark your writing? I do that too. For just $6 per chapter, I will tell you how awful that your writing is. But not to worry if you feel like you couldn't take the criticism. I also offer regular book editing as well, just $10 per chapter. You can contact me on any of my social media platforms if you have further questions. If you want to read some of the things that I've written, you can purchase my works on Amazon. I have a slew of spicy short stories and 2 full-length novels. I also frequently run flash sales on my stories, and if you don't follow me on any social media, you might want to do so just so you can know when I might be offering things for free. Links for everything will be posted below. See you next week, guys!